Welcome back. This is Psychology Applied to Work, Lecture 9, Why We Work. All right, as always, we will begin with a quick review of what we covered in the last lecture. And the last lecture was the second half of the Chapter 3 lecture. Hopefully you're staying caught up in the reading. Lecture 8 was job performance. So we talked about task performance, the things that we're required to do, and then we talked about contextual performance, things like organizational citizenship behaviors, the things that help sort of keep the glue together, that are sometimes difficult to define, but just as important. And then we talked about counterproductive work behavior, whether directed, sort of interpersonally, at individual to individual, or sort of whole cloth counterproductive work behavior directed at the whole organization. And then we talked about job crafting, which was how to, or just the phenomenon of jobs evolving into the strengths of the individual in some cases, and both that as a formal process and then that as an informal process that often happens, whether it's intended or not. All right, well, now we are into Lecture 9, our third bonus lecture. We are going to ask the question, why is it that we work after all? And obviously, we work to get resources, and we'll talk a little bit in more detail about that. Sometimes we say we work to be happy, or we certainly want to work to be happy. I might challenge that a little bit. We work for a sense of community. We work for duty's sake. We work or wish we worked to get meaning. And perhaps we even work because at some level maybe we need just a little bit of struggle, a little bit of stretch, a little challenge, a little strife in our life, and we seek that out. All right, well, let's talk about resources first. Resources and rewards, and obviously money is the first one. Sorry about that. Money pays for money gets you fed, money gets you a place to live, money gets you a car, money gets you gas. It gets you, many of the tangible things in life that we need. And if we didn't work, we typically don't have money unless you're lucky. And so obviously, first and foremost, the resources we get through the exchange medium that is money is the first reason why we work. Now, an interesting thing, lack of money is definitely a stressor. Lack of money can result in not being able to get enough to eat, not having a place to live, not being able to buy clothes for your kids. I mean, lots of things associated with specifically being poor come with stress, and that particular stress, the stress that specifically comes from not having enough money, does go away with money. It is not the only stress in your life, but there's definitely something to be said for having enough money to prevent situations in your life that are very stressful. Now, back in 2010, these 2010 dollars, these dollars would be a little bit higher now. This notion of does money buy you happiness was challenged, and a better conceptualization was brought out in the literature, and instead a more accurate way of looking at this is that the more money you make, starting from nothing, the less stress you have, and therefore the more, say, opportunities to be happy or to be pleased with your life and that sort of thing. But an interesting thing happened, at least according to the 2010 dollars, is is it was a pretty straightforward relationship. The more money you had, the less stress you had, until you got around $75,000, which back in 2010 was about the amount you needed to at least have a decent place to live, a decent car, be able to have decent food, maybe have health insurance and get some gas and take care of stuff. And so the things that would be very stressful if you didn't have them were taken care of. And so the curve sort of bent at that point, where the more money you were making, the less stress you had. And then once you got to this sort of threshold level, that effect dramatically slowed. But it didn't disappear. And there was a negative correlation between negative emotion, or this, generally speaking, negative affect, bad feelings, things that we would associate with stress. There was a negative relationship with that and money, as in the more money you made, the less stress you had. The slope dramatically reduced at that 75,000 a year mark. Now that would be different depending on where you live. Rural areas versus very expensive housing areas, then that number would be different. So that's an aggregate number in the U.S. But they also found that although the effect was less, and so the slope was less, that reduction in negative emotion continued until about 200,000 a year, at which point it plateaued. Now that may be because that's just you taking care of all the stresses that lack of money can have, but it also could be that having money itself is not free, so to speak, and that having a lot of money, while it might be a very high-class problem that people who don't have much money would love to experience, it isn't without its own sources of stress and concern. So. And then people inherently have a level of sort of baseline reaction, sort of baseline negative emotion, at least negative emotional response at least, that if we didn't have that, wouldn't have proper worry and other stuff in our lives. So anyway, interesting phenomenon. Money doesn't buy happiness, but money can definitely reduce stress. Then the kind of stress that definitely ruins happiness. And we're going to talk about happiness. And I might challenge your thoughts about that a little bit on the next slide. Another obvious reason people work is benefits. For good or for ill, we have a health insurance system that's typically tied to employment in many cases, and we have kind of a convoluted healthcare system in the U.S. where we have multiple healthcare systems. We have the insurance-based system that's associated with your employer. You can go directly to insurance yourself. You can pay directly to healthcare providers, and then there are multiple forms of government assistance. One where the government pays after it's happened, or in some cases, the government is the provider in the case of things like the VA. So we have a complicated and expensive healthcare system, and in many cases, it is a critical need for people, and one of the key reasons and why they have to work. And in fact, it's such a critical reason that for a number of people, it is why they, can't retire. Because their health insurance will just be too much, and they can't afford it. And sometimes they have to bridge a gap between when they could otherwise retire financially, and when they might be eligible for Social Security and Medicare, and so they still work, provided that where they're working gives them appropriate benefits. It's another reason why people feel stuck in certain jobs. They're in a job they hate, but they have really good benefits, and it gives health insurance for their kids, and maybe one of their children has special medical needs, and if they went to a different job that they might find much more fulfilling, they wouldn't have as good a benefits. So it's definitely it depends on the person in this situation, but sometimes benefits can be every bit as compelling as the money itself. Another reason, a little bit, this could be its own category. This isn't really resources. It's sort of a reward, but it's definitely a reason why people work, and that's to improve their future chances. To to get experience, to establish a kind of a body of work that might get them credentialed. The ability to sort of carve your own job out in the future is based upon what you can do to demonstrate what your value is. And so a lot of times people are in a job as a means to get the experience they need to get the job they're really after, or their future aspirations. So that's definitely a reason why people work. The fact of the matter is to climb, so to speak, to get more money, to climb competence and prestige hierarchies at workplaces, demonstrated experience and high performance within that experience is obviously better than poor performance, and it's definitely a reason why people work. And another reason people work is exchange. Not everybody does things for an employer and a paycheck. There's still plenty of barter that's around, especially in the trades where people sort of they're sole proprietors of their own plumbing business or something construction related or repair or whatever, and when they're interacting with each other, occasionally they discover a mutual need, and in order to, in some cases this is tax avoidance and other reasons to do this, but there's still a non-trivial amount of direct exchange-based work. I'll do a bunch of work for you if you give me a bunch of lumber or whatever. Anyway, so these should be obvious, and if you thought about it, you could probably make a list of other interesting reasons why people work that could be in the resources or rewards category. All right, let's talk about happiness a little bit. This culture, in my opinion, we are uniquely obsessed with happiness to our own detriment. Frankly, we're chasing happiness to the point where it is making us miserable. I mean, we are precisely getting the opposite of what we're looking for. And there's an interesting book here if people are interested in reading a little bit more. And there's a number of other books on this topic. This isn't this is a topic a lot of people talk about, and a number of people have said the kinds of things I'm saying. That happiness itself, as an end goal, often isn't wise, and it often drives behavior that results in exactly the opposite of what you think you were looking for. And one of those things stems from what do we really mean by that? What do you mean when you say you want to be happy? Follow your dreams. Do what makes you happy. Okay, what do we mean by that word? And let's think about it. As a culture, we often mistake or conflate or say fail to differentiate the concept of hedonia versus eudaimonia. It's an annoying pronunciation. And this goes back to Aristotle. But really, what we're talking about is short-term, shallow in the moment, pleasure-seeking happiness versus deep, long-lasting, meaningful satisfaction type of happiness. In the former, in the hedonia state, I mean that's you're laughing at a movie, you're laughing with friends, or you're just in a state of joy, and that could be assisted with drugs, that could be assisted with sex. There's just a lot of things that are hedonic, cheesecake, and we often, as a culture, you don't think enough about distinctions between that short-term pleasure versus deep, lasting satisfaction. Deep fulfillment, doesn't produce laughter. And it doesn't produce a kind of shallow euphoria. It's deeper than that, and it's often a complex feeling, because often deep satisfaction comes from something that maybe took sacrifice and commitment and maybe even involved some loss. But when you look at it and think about it, you have a kind of deep satisfaction associated with it. And what do we mean by happiness? Do we mean hedonia, or do we mean something more deep and more meaningful? So people should think about that term when they're either asking themselves, hey, what makes me happy? What should I do? And especially when they're talking to others, because there's a big difference between, hey, what makes you laugh? What gives you short-term joy, versus what will give you deep satisfaction. So these are big deals, and frankly, our culture right now is not understanding this very well, and it's driving a lot of bad behavior. It's frankly driving a lot of tragedy. Do you want to feel good? Do you want to feel pleasure, or do you want purpose in your life? And fine, you want both. Great, I do too. But when you're making choices, do we think this through? And do we think long term? Which choices between those two? The short-term feel-good hedonic pleasure versus something that might take time to germinate. That's something that might require sacrifice. That might even might require a kind of pain and endurance and painful trade-offs to do. Which one do you actually think is better for your long-term mental health, for your flourishing, for your success? Which do you think is better for our society as a whole? Is it better to ask yourself, am I happy, or am I on a path to be happy? Or am I fulfilled, or will that make me fulfilled? And to have a more sophisticated conceptualization of these terms, a more sophisticated understanding of these terms, and to not be shallow about this concept of happiness, or it will drive you to short-term thinking, and it could in fact drive you to misery. So what's better? Is it really better to pursue happiness, or is it better to pursue fulfillment? Now we say the word I'm not happy, but when we say that, we usually mean that as a kind of sarcasm for I'm unhappy, and to be unhappy, that's usually a negative state. That is not necessarily the same as not being happy. You can choose to not pursue happiness. You can choose to not do something even though it would make you happy. But that doesn't mean you'll be unhappy. I don't. The things in my life that I've found, deeply fulfilling, I don't associate the term unhappy with those things. And there is a hell of a lot of room, between, something that is giddy, that makes you feel giddy, and something that will make you miserable. And so consider perhaps in your life choices, that fulfillment beats happiness. And happiness comes and goes. Happiness is a nice reward, but to chase it almost guarantees that you won't find it. This is a big deal. We are often a narcissistic culture, a self-assessed culture, a culture that we tell each other, to ask ourselves, are we happy? And for a number of people, you can ask yourself, am I happy? And you can think about that, and it doesn't trip you up, and you come to some sort of conclusion at the time, and you move on with your life. But for a large subset of people, that kind of thinking, am I happy, as opposed to am I fulfilled, or am I making choices that lead me towards fulfillment, satisfaction, and meaning? But that thing of am I happy often can lead to a kind of shallow introspection. Like, you introspect, you try to get a sense for your own emotional state at the time. You're thinking about yourself. In fact, you're thinking about your thinking and your emotions. There's a metacognition associated with it. And what can happen with some people is they can build a ruminatory circuit, or strengthen it. Where rumination, means really just fixating and thinking about the same thing and thinking about the same thing. It comes from cows, that sit and chew all the time because they're ruminants. Anyway, this obsession with your own happiness can create a fixation, and special. I'm not happy. Why am I not happy? Maybe it's because of this. Maybe it's because of that. And then now you actually find things. You find sources in your memory or in just construing them. You find things, and yeah, that's because of this, and that really makes me unhappy. And then I'm going to really think about that, and wow, I do feel unhappy. And for some people, that can become a reciprocally causal, vicious cycle, where you feel a little unhappy, you think about it, and you ruminate, and you line up all the things in your life that are making you unhappy, and lo and behold, you feel even less happy, which gets you, kind of down further. And then you start thinking about, my life isn't turning out very well, and things really suck, and I'm, not going to become anybody, and I'm just a loser, and I'm whatever, and you just spiral, and for some people, that spiral is a depression spiral. Some people it's a anxiety spiral. Some people it's both. And for some people, those spirals end in suicide. And I'm not being so simplistic as to say that if you simply ask yourself, "Am I happy?" that's going to lead to these things. But as a culture, we seem to put too much emphasis on this concept of immediate gratification and hedonic feelings and pleasure, and we're all sitting here, trying to chase that stuff, and it's not the path. It's not the path to satisfaction. And the harder you try to chase happiness, the more you increase your odds of actually finding misery. So there's that. All right, let's get back to why we work. And one of the obvious reasons why we work is a sense of community. Our own identity is locked together with our in-group. I mean, just to acknowledge, your in-group, is itself an identification. I'm a member of this. These are my people. That's certainly not the end-all be-all of identity, but it is a core dimension of identity. So, having an in-group, having a place to work that these are my peeps. This is my company. This is my organization. These are my co-workers. For a lot of people, that gives a good sense of communion, and strengthens our identity. And where we work can often be part of our own personal brand. So now we're getting into some of the cultural artifacts around identity, and certainly in the age of Instagram and other things. I guess it's TikTok now. One's personal brand is becoming something people are more aware of for good and for ill. But anyway, if you work for a prestigious company, or a prestigious organization that in and of itself puts you a little bit higher in a prestige hierarchy, and that can be something that people like. Sometimes somebody without a job, that's like, an organization ostracized you, kicked you out. Something's wrong with that person, and we often stigmatize people who are out of work, and it's sort of like a meta out group, and it can be devastating. It can be humiliating for people to be out of work. I mean, whether they were fired for performance or the company just ran out of money and they got laid off. But obviously they're different things, and their effects can have different levels. But either way, being jobless is sort of being cast out of your in-group to some extent. And at this point, it should be clear, this in-group concept, we don't have one in-group. We have in-group, we have mechanisms in our brain that seem to be built around this notion of in-group, out-group. We behave a certain way within in-groups, and we behave a different way with out-groups. But we are highly flexible creatures, able to have hierarchies and networks that extend across sort of different constructs. And you can have a work construct in your mind that's sort of like a location. Again, all of our cognition to some extent. You can think of that as a spatial process in the abstract. And so you can think of your work in group versus like your family in group versus like your friend in group, and the people you went to college from in group, and your church in group, or whatever in group. They might not have very many overlapping people, but you can still have that sort of in group thought process to varying strengths associated with them, and work is definitely activating that. So, and an interesting thing in the West is where we work is a huge part of our external facing identity. When you die, people at your funeral and when they're remembering you, I'll often just talk about your relationships, your family and those sorts of things. But boy, in the West at least, when we're alive, that there's primacy to this. So what do you do? And obviously, who you are is more than that, and we that isn't the only thing we care about. But it's pretty important. So what you do, is a very culturally important thing, and by having that job, especially if it's like perceived as a really good job or a really good company, there's a kind of status that comes from that, and a kind of stability, and a kind of validation that is in and of itself a reason to work. And we do spend a great deal of time, 2,000 plus hours a year, and when we're there, we often find our friends, and sometimes find spouses. Sometimes we find people that aren't our spouses, but they're still mating behavior going on. So lots of things happen at work, and for a lot of people, work is where their friends are, or they might be single, and work is their best place to actually be able to find a future spouse. Community, communal, pro-social, these are all sort of the same thing, and it's a good reason why we work. In camaraderie can be fun. It can be both hedonic and eudaimonic. I don't know. I hate pronouncing it. It can be both shallow fun, and it can be long-lasting fun. And then also, not always great. We can also experience interpersonal conflict, and that can be a reason why we might want to not work, or at least not work there. All right, let's talk about another reason why we work. This is sort of a cultural construct, but it definitely drives a lot of people to stay in a job, or work a certain way, or go to a particular job, and that's a sense of duty. And notions of duty, they are in multiple cultures, but in America at least, in parts of Europe, there is a thread inside of it that is really strong and built around Protestant work ethic. And the Protestant work ethic was pretty severe. We're not here for joy. We are here for toil, and we don't do anything vain. The reward is in heaven. The toil, is for the life here on earth, and that builds a lot of barns. There's a lot of things that come from highly aligned people willing to just chop wood all day. But if you remember my previous lecture where I talked about the book The Renegade History of the United States, it was not universally liked, and still is a part of our culture that is just sort of one dimension of some tension, and even at a certain level, there's a hedonia, eudaimonia element to that too. The short term versus the long term. In the case of the more original and severe Protestant work ethic, the ultimate long lasting was supposed to happen, after you died, when your reward would be in heaven. But that's just sort of a time scale and a construct in there. It's still the same sort of pleasure now, versus satisfaction later, even if the satisfaction comes with exhaustion and scars and other things. So the Protestant work ethic is definitely with us today. And interestingly enough, it seems like every culture is accused of being the one that no longer has it. And I'm old enough to have seen that pattern. There's aspects of this that are more than just work. It's about accepting your responsibility. It's about carrying your share of the burden, and doing your duty. And it's part of our social contract. And this is evolving, and it takes different forms depending upon sort of subcultures and individual families and regional areas. But outside of the West, these are still senses of responsibilities and carrying your burden. These are not uniquely Western constructs. They're just they're defined a little bit differently, and they're attached to different things. But a sense of duty is a powerful thing. And there's it's a production scavenger game. It's a game theory where you can run simulations, and you can also look at like animals. Idea is, to what extent are you helping the group, and to what extent are you loafing off of the group? And we have pretty sensitive detection circuits for when people aren't carrying their share of the burden. And we also have we conflate or we link in duty, with noble action. There's a kind of commitment and sacrifice and loss associated with duty. If you are going to do your duty, it is expected that there's things you're not doing that might be more beneficial for you as an individual, or more pleasurable. So it's also tied to our concept of sacrifice. And interesting, in risk of taking the bonus lecture off on a 5-hour tangent, I'll watch my time really closely and try to make this more seconds than minutes. This notion of sacrifice is really important, and it's key to the success of our society. It's key to the success of an agrarian society. When you think about going from a hunter-gatherer culture to ultimately a farming culture, especially in a temperate zone where you have winter, it is critical that you work very, very hard, sun up to sunrise, to make sure you get enough crops so that you survive the winter, and you also need to have enough crops to keep your livestock alive. And there's a good argument that this notion of sacrifice that popped up in many religions, and certainly in the Judeo-Christian lineage, sacrifice is very prominent in the Old Testament, but it certainly exists in multiple religions. And the idea is, one idea behind why that seems to pop up is if you're willing to make a sacrifice for and it might be one of your goats or whatever, you are deliberately taking an action that is going to be creating loss for you, and you're doing it in order to bring favor from your God or gods. But this notion of inflicting short-term pain for long-term gain, that doing that performatively in the form of a ritual sacrifice is believed to be critical to getting a culture to take the long term much more seriously. And you could make the argument that the Protestant work ethic sort of took that to 11. All right, that wasn't too much of a sidebar. All right, another reason we work, or at least we work in hope of, is meaning. This is a word kind of like happiness. And do we even know what it means? There's an implicit level where we all know what this means, but when we really try to nail it down, it's hard. And the reason it's hard is likely because we've become so secular, because the things that you would have said 2, 3, 4, 500 years ago to answer this question were all framed within a totalizing religion that was also explained how the world got here and what we're supposed to do in life. And when you have a framework, a binding narrative for your large in-group that is totalizing, that includes the ises and the oughts, what is the world and what ought you do, and that includes what your burden is that you're supposed to carry, and what that purpose is and why, and it's all part of the bigger picture, so to speak, and it's all this interwoven, totalizing, coherent web. Meaning isn't a thing you go search for. Meaning is it's just there every day. You're born into it. You're born into a certain burden you have to carry. You're born into the work you need to do, and what you're doing to carry things on. And we have, in many ways in our culture, dismantled that. And that was a byproduct of the Reformation to the Renaissance, to the Enlightenment and Scientific Revolution. We talked about that a little bit in a previous lecture, but the definition of what is, and the emergence of science, and the emergence of sort of evidence, and the emergence of the dominance of the left hemisphere in our culture. And the left hemisphere, is the one that only believes in what can be explained. A thing you can put words to, a thing you can carve at the joints and break into pieces, and nothing exists except that. And so, in many ways, our culture has fallen into left hemispheric dominance. And there's a absolutely, you might want to put it off for a little bit, but there's a fantastic book called The Master and His Emissary about that. But it's a pretty dense book. Anyway, we have a situation in our culture where, we don't know what meaning is, and it can definitely be described as a kind of crisis of meaning. And we have a lot of depression, and we have anxiety, and we have addiction, and we have suicide, and we have all of these competing ideologies trying to fill this gap where we need this totalizing explanatory framework that tells us who we are and what we're supposed to do. And I'm getting a wee bit past the workplace here, but this is when you think about how core what you do is to your identity in our culture. This crisis of meaning is absolutely applicable to work as well, and the job that you do, and whether or not you find it meaningful is really important. First, does meaning correlate with happiness? And if so, is it positive? If you have a job that makes me happy, is that going to mean it's meaningful? Or perhaps the correlation might be negative. The less happy you are in a job, maybe that maybe your odds of that job being meaningful go up. It's really something to think about, and I'll give you an example here. Nurses and doctors in pediatric oncology. Do they work to pursue happiness? Pediatric oncology is childhood cancer. So if you're a healthcare worker and every day, whether you're a nurse or a doctor or an aide, but every day at work, it's kids with cancer. And if you end up being, one of the things that the best of the best pediatric oncologists, childhood cancer doctors, the best of the best end up doing is working with the hardest and hardest cases. So that just doesn't strike me as a thing that would make me happy and make these healthcare workers happy. But at the same time, what could be more important than doing whatever you can to try to help these children? So it could be very meaningful. So these things are complicated. I'm not saying there aren't places where happiness and meaning go together, but it's they're not the same thing. So carrying your burden for your in-group, the doing what is needed for your in-group, that with purposeful action, and the burden part matters. The knowing that this is a kind of sacrifice, that you had to give certain things up to do this, but this is essential for your in-group. I mean, that's often a thing that can be meaningful for a role. Interesting thing is being recognized for that. That can give you a validation. That's good. That is a like you in your role. Congratulations, you're awesome. Here's a reward or a plaque or whatever. That isn't necessarily a thing that gives you meaning, but it is something that gives you and it's an acknowledgement of status. So that's like a group recognition of where you are in a hierarchy, and that's its own thing. But it isn't necessarily a thing that will make you feel like you've definitely accomplished something, because if it really wasn't burdensome or not. If that thing was easy, and then you're happy to be higher up in the hierarchy, but you don't necessarily feel that deep satisfaction because it was easy. So it's an interesting phenomenon where in order to have that lasting satisfaction, in order to have that deep, meaningful association with something, it almost has to have a burden. It almost has to have a kind of pain. It almost has to have a cost. And one could make a strong argument that we may be built around that. And that when we don't have that hard cost, we just don't feel like it could possibly be something meaningful, and we don't get the kind of deep satisfaction. So being praised for something that was easy is not that validating. So this notion, that burdens, carrying a burden, and that pushing through strife gives us some meaning, and this idea that maybe it's critical is an interesting concept, and I don't think you'll get every psychologist and sociologist and anthropologist to line up lockstep with this, but it's a pretty compelling argument to me, and that ends our lecture here with this fun book called Bullshit Jobs, which I recommend. And in fact, David Graeber, the author who died recently, I've read all of his books, and his politics are maybe not entirely something I'm aligned with, but his perspective is very interesting. And I mentioned in an earlier lecture how we often define ourselves. Our in-group often can define ourselves around of who we're not. We aren't the people that eat pork. We aren't the people that wear these certain things. That definition as against a group. So you define yourself against something. David Graeber, and David Wengrow and David Graeber explored that in this really good book called The Dawn of Everything, which challenges this notion that you often run into politics right now. It's like the world is either capitalism or socialism, or capitalism and communism, with socialism being, communism light, and like that's the only dimension. This is an interesting book that looks at everything they can find about cultures and about systems and economic systems in ancient cultures, and they would contend that the actual ways in which culture can manifest in terms of economies and traditions and roles are ridiculously various. That there's a cornucopia of expression in culture, and that we have in our modern culture have parodied it almost. We have dimensionally reduced it all the way down to these narrow dimensions, and in our concepts of even with concepts of freedom and that sort of thing. So again, if I'm showing you a book or suggesting a book, that doesn't mean that I'm endorsing everything in this book, or telling you that you should. In fact, you should read counter narratives, and you should steel man, which is to say, really understand the strengths of an argument that is opposite of a position you hold, so that you can really make sure that what you feel is true, is well understood, and that you can strongly defend it against the best argument. So keep an open mind and read things that you disagree with. But anyway, Bullshit Jobs is a fun book, and it's an irreverent title, and it's a mildly irreverent in the content, but it's also it's a serious book, and the people need we get self-worth from our work, and yet people generally kind of hate their jobs, not universally, but maybe more often than not, and certain things happen. Like it's a common thing where somebody that wins the lottery often ends up depressed, because they didn't earn it, they didn't carry a burden, and that's this whole notion of do we need this to work ultimately? Do we need work to kind of be have strife? Do we need work maybe to have a certain level of bullshit in order for us to recognize it as a burden? And so this book was really fun. He broke jobs into flunkies, goons, duct tapers, box tickers, and taskmasters. So like a flunky was somebody that makes their boss look good. Like a greeter or an attendant or a receptionist or an assistant, in that having one increases the prestige hierarchy of the boss. In a goon is somebody that is paid to basically deceive others. So this was like a corporate lobbyist or telemarketers and public relations people. And a duct taper, is somebody that just fixes a problem temporarily instead of permanently, like airline desk people that just soothe you over your lost luggage, but don't do anything to prevent future lost luggage, or somebody that's fixing software code of just bloated code that had been worked on by piles of people over piles of years, and they're just sort of stitching stuff together and not making it any more stable. And box tickers are they're trying to create the appearance of something being useful. Compliance officers to some extent, people that are into survey administrators or in some cases quality service people, and taskmasters are people who create unneeded extra work, and middle management is number one on taskmasters. So he's not saying that every single job is like this, but he categorized these, and there's a lot of fun truth to these things. But he also explored this notion of strife a little bit, and that people who are in these types of jobs, they don't like them, and he contends that they're bullshit, which is to say they actually don't do anything for the company. In fact, they just take money, and that most of the work inside them, most of these activities, are actually not needed. They don't provide value for society. It's an interesting take, and you know, you might, if you're thinking about what you want to do in life, you know, maybe look at this and add it to your knowledge to try to decide what you want to do. But if you think at the end of the day, he's on to something, and it's certainly not, he's not the first one, because it goes back thousands of years. This notion that we need to carry a burden, and that a certain amount of pain, a certain amount of bullshit, you know, lets us know it's real, and gives us sort of the hurt we need at some weird level, to give us the sense that, okay, that had to get done, and that was actually something that you know, I did, and I accomplished that, and you know, it sucked, but you know, it's over, and I got it done, and now I have some satisfaction. So interesting, lots of reasons why we work, and we covered a lot of ground here. I hope this was interesting. So, you know, is this bullshit part of our need for discipline and self-sacrifice? You know, is this some sort of weird thing that seems like it's the opposite of what the Protestant work ethic is pushing, but you know, at some level maybe it's the same. You know, and so we have these concepts in our culture. You know, work forms character, and so, you know, I challenge you to think: does the self-respect, to some extent, depend on strife? You know, are we hardwired, and has our culture then wired itself around that hardwiring for needing to carry a burden? And you know, in my opinion, so far in my life, I think the answer is yes. Hope this was an interesting lecture for you. So, you know, life is suffering. It's a common refrain, you know, of many religions, and it's something to think about. Okay, let's recap. We talked about why we work, and we talked about you know, money and other resources. We talked about, you know, whether happiness was achievable, and whether it's a good thing or not to try to pursue it. We talked about the sense of community, sense of belonging, sense of identity in groups, as a compelling reason why we work. And we talked about a sense of duty, and how ingrained that is in our culture. We talked about meaning, and we got a little deep there. I hope it was okay. And we talked about strife and bullshit jobs. So hope this was an okay lecture, and it wasn't too long. This concludes Unit 1, and so you're now eligible to take the test as soon as I put it up. I haven't put it up yet, at least at the time of this recording, but I will shortly. The test is open book, open note, but not open friend. I haven't set the time yet. I will shortly, but the time will be based upon the amount of time needed to get it done if you've actually studied, if you actually know the core concepts, so that you don't have to look everything up. I'm going to work out how long it would take to look everything up, and make sure that the test is not that long. So that you do spend some time to get to go over the notes, that you do pay attention when you're reading, and you do think about these, you know, some of the fundamental terms, especially if there's overlap between the notes and the book. That's a good sign that that's material that matters. And then yeah, if you do that, the test should be potentially easy. We'll see. Wish you luck. And then lecture 10 for Unit 2 is psychological tests for work. And so that includes like selection tests. You know, to some extent, these are you know, screens to try to figure out who's qualified. We're going to talk a little bit about the concept of validity and reliability, which anytime you do a psychological test, you know, you really need to make sure they're valid, make sure they're reliable. And valid means that they actually do what you think they're going to do, and reliable means that you know, they work every time, very roughly speaking. And then we're going to talk about different methods of testing, and we're going to talk about cognitive tests, and we're going to talk about personality inventories. So that should be an interesting lecture as well. All right, hope this was interesting, and we will see you for lecture 10.